I am going to present to you our special guest this afternoon, wildlife photographer and namesake of our latest exhibition year, Ronan Donovan. You hopefully know that's who you're here to see. Mr. Donovan is known for his years of work as a conservation photographer, filmmaker, wildlife biologist, and National Geographic Explorer and Storytelling Fellow. In 2019, he released his first documentary series, which you might have seen, Kingdom of the White Wolf, about his work amongst the wolves of Ellesmere Island. And his film work has been published by National Geographic, PBS Nature, and BBC. As you bear witness to his work in the exhibition, Wolves, the Photography of Ronan Donovan, you will come to understand what he means when he speaks of his role as a visual storyteller. Now, I think that you're going to actually learn a lot more about him and his photography by hearing directly from him. So, if you will please help me welcome him to the stage, Ronan Donovan.
Thank you so much, Ernest. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate you all making time on a Saturday, kind of midday. I just got in from Montana yesterday, and I've been basically sweating this whole time since I got here. But it's been magical to be by the ocean again. I went to, Fort DeSoto State Park. Went there this morning, went for a swim. It was glorious. Got to watch oyster catchers making their little feeding out of those little oysters or clams that they get, and they have a perfectly shaped bill. They can just slice them open and get a snack. Frigate birds flying over. It was great. I'm always amazed at, especially with urban centers, cities, where the line between the modern human world and the wild world next to the ocean it's like a actual line. Like, the ocean is wild. It is a straight up wilderness. The whole world is happening underwater there. It's really a treat to be here. So thank you all for inviting me in. Grateful to the James Museum to being here and all of you being interested about wolves today. Yes. So the exhibit is upstairs, and I've had a chance to walk through, and it's great to be with those images and with those wild ones again. And I hope all of you will be able to have a chance to take a walk through. This presentation today, this talk, is going to be kind of some behind the scenes and weaving you all through this kind of narrative of my path towards understanding wolves. I didn't grow up with wolves. I grew up in Vermont, and we don't have wolves there anymore. And the first time that I experienced wolves in the wild was in the West, in Montana and in Wyoming. And so I'm going to share a bit, and then we will have a little Q&A at the end, and you get to ask your question and hear what you're thinking about wolves. So as I mentioned, my first interaction with wolves was in the West, and this is a place, Yellowstone National Park, that many of us are familiar with for its wild landscapes. And this image is a representation of the history that is there in Yellowstone, that is present. It is a place that has held kind of this life, death, rebirth cycle for hundreds of millions of years. It has erupted and essentially blanketed the continent with meters of ash. And then over time, it has fertilized the Midwest, and animals come back. And it's also in this relationship to the modern human unfolding of how we relate to the natural world. There is also a life, death, rebirth cycle there that I'll speak to. Specifically around wolves, our relationship to wolves goes very far back. It's a millions and millions of year old relationship. We were bumping into wolves in Eurasia, and they were the first animal that we domesticated some 20 or 30,000 years ago, depending on the archaeology. And we did this thing. We took a large wild animal, and we made it into a friend in all these different forms. And wolves and dogs are the same animal, or the same species. The domestic dog is just a subspecies of the wild wolf, but basically means they're the same animal. And we, as humans, we realized very quickly that these animals were very valuable to our well-being. We would have bumped into them on the landscape as early hunters. We evolved to hunt the same thing that wolves hunt. These are large, hooved herd animals, elk and deer and buffalo and moose. And so we would have been on the landscape as early humans. This is an artist's depiction of kind of, let's say, Beringia or North American continent some 20,000 years ago. And we had dogs in the form of wolves with us already at that time. And there's some amazing oral history stories from around the West of domestication happening fluidly. People were domesticating wolves routinely. It's not something that happened one time. And I didn't really understand that well until going to the Arctic and spending time with wolves that aren't fearful of people, where they are right next to you. And if I was hunting, we would become fast friends. So the modern relationship in Yellowstone to land and to conservation, I think of Yellowstone as kind of this beating heart of the modern understanding of conservation. You know, we came out west as a different people on this landscape, leaving Europe and coming to North America. And there was a relationship to wolves that was one of, we didn't want them here. We wanted them to be absent. There was a conflict between this idea of power over the land, power over animals. And it wasn't just wolves, it was wolves and grizzly bears and beavers and buffalo. There was a mass die-off and killing of all of those animals at the hand of people that were trying to make money off of the land. And it is still unfolding. That relationship is still in process, and it's very recent. And wolves are at the heart of that in many ways, because we love them in the form of our dogs, but we fear and not really sure what to think of them in their wild form. So in Yellowstone, wolves were absent for about 70 years. It was part of Park Service policy to trap wolves, and the last wolves were trapped in the 1920s. And then people realized that the landscape was suffering. And so it was decided in 1995 and 1996 to live capture wolves in British Columbia and Alberta, Canada, and transport them to Yellowstone under the Endangered Species Act. And it was this realization that the landscape was unraveling in these ways where Park Service had to actually ship thousands of elk out of Yellowstone National Park in the early 1900s. There were actual culls within the park that the Park Service was doing to reduce the elk herds. And there's all these different kind of trickle-down effects when you remove an animal like a wolf that is considered a keystone species. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that term, but it's very recent in the modern relationship to understanding ecology that there are certain animals that have a weighted effect on the health of the landscape, and wolves and other predators are some of those, where they have this kind of top-down management of species. So thinking about this on a map, looking at how modern humans basically tried to remove wolves from the entire lower 48. There's red kind of tinge here on where we are in the southeast here. That is another wolf species called the red wolf that used to be throughout Florida. There's just a little tiny corner in North Carolina, Alligator National Wildlife Refuge, where they were reintroduced after they were all live captured. I think there's about 18 individuals perhaps that they started with. And they had a captive breeding program and then have been trying to establish a viable wild population. And I think there's still just around 20 of them in the wild now. There's a place that I was corrected on last night. I said, there's no wolves in Florida anymore. There's an island called St. Vincent Island, apparently, that is off the panhandle. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service will put a couple red wolves there, a pair of them, as kind of like a wild way for them to breed, and then they'll capture the pups and then distribute them throughout more captive breeding programs. So there are some red wolves on an island in Florida, just for those of you that Navy came last night, wanted to correct that. This map, we added this, we made this with National Geographic. We added this dotted line as a representation of where wolves were hunted and trapped and poisoned to. Essentially, there was this northern push to push them as far up as possible and rid the lower 48 of wolves. And so what I think about with this purple line is that was how far that was successful in the eradication. And this kind of darker tinge is where wolves are starting to come back, or where they've been allowed to come back. So this is another subspecies of wolf. It's a Mexican gray wolf in Arizona and New Mexico. That was a reintroduction. Yellowstone is here. Wolves are reintroduced in Yellowstone and in northern Idaho at the same time in 1995 and 96. And then this map isn't quite up to date now, but There are wolves all the way down kind of the spine of California, and there's even wolves like in LA County, which is a pretty amazing thing in the modern world to have a gray wolf coming back, being allowed to come back. And I think about this kind of relationship that I spoke to earlier that is still unfolding between modern humans and the wild. And the fact that wolves are back and the fact that we have places like Yellowstone National Park is a representation that I think modern humans are still very curious and longing to be part of something bigger than ourselves. Even if we don't fully understand what that means or why we're visiting Yellowstone or why we're drawn to wolves, I think it speaks to that aliveness that exists within all of us. We'll let the wolves here do a little chorus howl to get us into their life a little bit, thinking about them back in Yellowstone and this sound back on the landscape. That was the Molly's wolf pack, for any of you that are familiar with the wolves in Yellowstone. I'm going to speak a little bit to kind of the making of some of these images, some of the behind the scenes. This image is one of my favorites from Yellowstone. It depicts this old male named Mr. Blue by the tourists, the wolf watchers, and his collar name, his scientific name was 755M, and I prefer the Mr. Blue name. So Mr. Blue was actually an all-black wolf when he was born. And like some of us humans, we start to gray as we get older. Some of the wolves, that happens as well. So he was 7 years old during the time of this image. And this image was made with a motion-triggered camera. And so there's a few images in the exhibit, and you'll see in the caption that it'll speak to this. And I think it's helpful to illustrate a bit about how these images are made and what that means, what a motion-triggered camera is. So this is a setup from another place inside Yellowstone. This was part of an assignment that I was on for National Geographic magazine in 2014 and 15 for a 2016 article in National Geographic magazine that was dedicated solely to Yellowstone. And we had amazing permits and relationships to the Park Service. This is not something that people get to do. I probably will never be able to put camera traps out in Yellowstone again, just based on the unique relationship that we had at that time. And it was part of the 100-year anniversary of the National Park Service. And so National Geographic and the park headquarters in DC worked out this agreement where we were able to put these motion-triggered cameras throughout the parks. This is in Pelican Valley. This is kind of in the center of Yellowstone. And I set up this camera on a elk carcass. Wolves had killed this elk, and I knew animals were going to be coming for weeks and sometimes months afterwards. And so I set up this camera, and wolves can be shy to cameras. If you notice here, there's just a little wolf tail there. And this is kind of how things go with camera traps, with these motion-triggered systems. There's a bit of a time period where the animals start to get used to the image. And so you have a lot of mishaps, a lot of missed frames. Some of them still work. This I find to be a really beautiful image. Some of them start to come together in these more beautiful ways. And I'm always trying to understand and speak to the context of photos. And these camera traps allow for some more of an intimate relationship to, especially with wolves in Yellowstone that are fearful of people. They're still hunted and trapped outside of Yellowstone. And so you can't get this close to wolves legally in Yellowstone. You have to be within 100 meters of wolves to stay within the regulations. But camera traps allow for this experience as if we are there, sitting or standing on this bank. And some of the backstory of this image, this is a very large male elk, and he was killed by this pack of wolves. This is the Molly's pack of wolves again. He was killed by the pack, and in that process, in September, he actually kicked and killed the lead male, the oldest male in the group. And he had a collar on him, and that's why the biologists knew that this event had happened. The collar has a mortality signal when it stops moving, and they went in and were able to understand through a necropsy of what happened to that male. And I was surprised to learn through the biologists that 15% of wolf mortality in Yellowstone is from their prey, it's from hunting. And so you think of wolves being these very proficient hunters and being able to kind of get away with whatever they want. But it's actually very hard to hunt animals in the wild, especially wolves that just have their mouths to do it. They have to put their face in this dangerous way where they're getting it cooked, kicked, or stomped, or trampled in that way. So these are some very hardy animals in that sense, and they're only successful about 20% of the time in their hunts. So I had this camera set up, and I was curious too about the buffalo movement. They migrate in and out of the park in the fall and come back in the spring. So I had this camera set up and making some images and was hopeful that maybe some wolves would come by and maybe there'd be a view of some of these. This is a very twilighty scene of a couple black wolves moving through. And I left it a little too long on the landscape, meaning the creek froze. And this wouldn't be a problem necessarily, but this is early in my career, and I had the bright idea to try to put some cameras in the water, in the trail where the animals were crossing. And so there's actually a couple cameras in this scene that you can't really see. And so there was a very hard few hours of chipping and asking myself, why did I do this? And also wondering, how am I going to tell my editor at National Geographic what happened to a couple of these cameras. This is a very dead and frozen camera. But luckily with National Geographic, of course, they have insurance, and they also understand that they want us to be able to take risks. And I do my best not to have this happen in the future, and I've done a pretty good job about not having this happen. But there are certainly occasions, especially with bears and other large animals, that like to sniff and check things out and sometimes chew on cameras. So that's some of the downside of these motion triggered camera systems that you put out on the landscape. This is one of my favorite images from the experience in Yellowstone. And this is not a motion triggered camera, although it feels like we're very close. This is a telephoto lens. Again, this is the Molly's wolf pack. I spent a lot of time with them during this assignment. And this is on the bank, so you can just kind of barely see this strip of water at the bottom of this frame. This is along the banks of the Yellowstone River. And in the winter, some of the buffalo have specific places where they cross. And when it's frozen, they will cross on the ice. And occasionally their weight will cause the ice to break and they will fall through. And a handful of buffalo will drown year to year. And they run ashore kind of in this shallow part of Yellowstone River. And this particular event, there was this male grizzly bear that the biologists, we nicknamed him Bearzilla. He was a very large grizzly bear. And this image was taken in March. And so this bear, could have been sleeping, but knew that there was going to be food and knows this place well. And so this grizzly bear would come, swim out or wade out to these carcasses and then wrestle, a 500 to 1,000 pound plus buffalo carcass, depending on the age and sex of the buffalo that died, and wrestle that carcass to the shoreline to have, a dry place to eat. And the wolves knew that this was happening as well. And so they would kind of patrol the shoreline of the Yellowstone River. And this was a place where I set up with a couple other photographers, and we spent 3 or 4 days waiting for the wolves or the grizzly bears to come. And in this particular case, it was the Molly's pack that came. And we have the female on the right here. So she's the biggest female that they've ever weighed in Yellowstone. They collared her, and her weight was 134 pounds, which is the average, a little more than the average for males, even in the park. So she was a very large female. And then the other two wolves are yearlings. So they were born essentially the previous year. They're 1-year-olds. Yeah, they very much knew we were there. This wasn't something that we were trying to hide or put up a blind or anything. It was just sitting on the bank and being present for that experience. This is an artist rendition. I spoke to earlier the idea of a keystone species, and this is kind of an oversimplified illustration of Yellowstone National Park, closest to me here, without wolves and overabundance of elk. You actually had an overabundance of coyotes as well. You had a decline in antelope populations. And then on the right side, you have this kind of abundance that is depicting wolves coming back, but also beavers. Beavers were reintroduced at the same time as wolves were, just outside of the park, just over the border on the Forest Service land. I think they introduced 30 plus beavers. And so you have this resurgence of two keystone species in Yellowstone at the same time, wolves and beavers. The wolves came back, they lowered the coyote populations that were unnaturally high. Pronghorn antelope started to recover more. Grizzly bears benefit from wolves being back on the landscape because there's more meat on the landscape. Of course, that benefits ravens. And then beavers being back is just a whole world of wetlands that beavers create. So it's this really interesting experience now in Yellowstone where in the last 150 years, Yellowstone today is the healthiest that it's ever been since it was a national park. How many of you have been to Yellowstone to watch wolves, perhaps specifically? Okay, we have some good wolf enthusiasts here. So this might be a familiar scene to you. These are wolf watchers or people that are just citizens, and many of them will come and perhaps camp, or they own a home just outside the park, and they spend basically every day, uh, and maybe throughout the winter or even all year round. Some of them are retired to come and watch wolves. They'll set up their scopes, and if you're there in Yellowstone and you're wanting to see wolves, you look for a scene like this. One or two people, or sometimes hundreds of people who have their spotting scopes and cameras set up, and they're out there to watch wolves. And it's this event that when they reintroduced wolves in Yellowstone, the biologists thought people aren't going to see wolves very often. They're going to be very shy, and it's not going to be something that tourists are going to get a chance to see maybe once in a while. But it's become a really magical education for people to be able to come see wolves. You can basically see wolves every day in Yellowstone if you know where to go in the northern range and you look for this scene and you stop and you spend some time. And generally they're little tiny specks, maybe miles away, but you still get to see them in the distance. Thinking about the relationship to humans outside of Yellowstone National Park, we have the research and we have tourists that get to see wolves inside Yellowstone, but the wolves don't respect the invisible boundaries that we created, and so they move in and out of the park. And this scene is one that created a lot of the initial fear and a lot of the initial removal of wolves from the landscape. And this is a range rider in a place called Tom Minor Basin. It's just north of Yellowstone National Park. And Bree here, she is engaged in a very old practice of spending time with livestock. And this is something that humans all over the world have done for the last 10,000 years, where you have prey that we domesticated and then you have to spend time with it. Sheep, think of a shepherd. There's maybe 30 plus livestock guard dog breeds that are used to keep animals safe from predators. And this is something that kind of fell out of practice in the United States for the last 100 years and is starting to come back in some of these different ways. And Bree is an example of that, where she's hired by an association, a grazing association of cattle in this basin. And she goes out and essentially putting human presence on the landscape is one of the best ways to reduce conflict with wolves, and as well as having livestock guard dogs, as well as moving your animals and keeping them bunched up. It's kind of this whole suite of practices. And another practice that Bree uses while she's getting kissed by her horse is putting up trail cameras. So similarly, having these kind of motion triggered cameras where you're able to see what's going on in the landscape. She is doing that to be able to pay attention to what's happening on the land. Where are the wolves moving? Where are the grizzly bears? Are there mountain lions or the coyotes in the landscape? So it's a way of understanding and kind of being in relationship to the animals that are also around you. And if Bree sees a wolf, or in this case, grizzly bear family, in and amongst the cows, and in this situation, these grizzly bears were digging for roots. This was in the fall. Bree will escort them politely out of the area. So it's kind of setting up boundaries in the fields where the cattle can be. We're going to spend the second half of this talk in a place that is very far from here. This is a place in the northern Canadian Arctic. It's the furthest northern landmass in Canada. And this is a really interesting landscape where we're 1,000 miles north of anything that looks like a tree. This is a polygon pond formation that takes thousands of years of freezing and thawing of the soil to then create these depressions that fill up with water and create these hundreds of little ponds. Any of you that saw the documentary Kingdom of the White Wolf, one of the packs in that I named the Polygon Pack. And it's a weird name to name a wolf pack, but it's after the Polygon Ponds, which were close to where they'd end. Just looking at a map of where we're talking about. We're way down here at the moment. This is about as far away as you can get in still North America. And so this is a place that's kind of an inset here showing you where we go. It's kind of the center of this island, the Photography Peninsula, it's called. And the images from this place are very different than those in Yellowstone. And while I was in Yellowstone, I always lamented not being able to see more family life of the wolves, because wolves are fearful of humans, couldn't get close, couldn't put cameras out, couldn't put them near dens. But in the Arctic, the wolves there, they're not fearful of humans. They're not hunted and trapped. They don't have this long lineage, at least on this part of the island, of being hunted and persecuted in that way. And so the relationship is very, it's very much like what we have with dogs. And these are, again, these are wild animals, but I'll show you some videos in a moment here that can illustrate that. But this is another one of those motion triggered cameras. Put it out the edge of the den here. You have mom coming back and greeting her little pup, and there's a babysitter there waiting. It's a 1-year-old wolf that would stay behind sometimes and take care of the little pup, keep it company. There's a game that canines play as well as humans play, and it's called Keep Away. And I'm sure many of you have played this game, perhaps with your dog, where your dog has a toy and they want you to try to get it. That's the whole game. You play tug of war with your dog. They want you to keep going, or they run with it and they want you to follow them. I played it with kids too. It's a very fun game. I have the thing that you want, come chase me. So wolves do that, of course. They do that with each other. Sometimes they do that with cameras of mine. This is one that I set up in the Arctic on an old musk oxen carcass. So here you have the Polygon Pack coming to snack. And now the camera is the toy. It's the inside of a wolf's mouth. And this is the object of desire at the moment. So these are the pups that are playing with it as well. One of the bigger wolves with it, running away. And so this was a small camera. This was basically a GoPro that I had modified to be triggered by motion. And they just picked it up and they ran with it. And when I came back a few days later, it took me about an hour to find the camera. I had to do these bigger kind of circles and then eventually found it. And they had only nibbled like a little small piece of it. It wasn't trashed at all. And of course, the card was still there. So that's them playing keep away with themselves. But they would also play keep away with me, or invite me into keep away, I should say. And what that looks like is, I remember one of the first times meeting the Polygon Pack, and I had two cameras. I had a long lens on a body, and then I had a wide lens camera at my foot next to me. And I was kind of kneeling down. I was taking pictures. Everything's going great. And then one of the wolves darted in and stole the camera. And this is like a big camera. It belonged to National Geographic, and it was early on in my assignment, and I needed the camera. Didn't want it to be on the landscape. Didn't want to put trash out on the landscape. All these reasons that I wanted it back. And I instinctively started chasing this wolf. And I named her Bright Eyes. She had kind of brighter eyes, and she's pretty mischievous one, as I come to learn. And so I'm like running on the tundra after a wild wolf. There's no chance that I'm ever going to catch her. And I realized very quickly, like, oh, this is keep away. I know this game very well. And so I did that thing where you feign interest and you kind of start walking away. You're looking over your shoulder. And she did the thing that you do, where she starts following me. And she gets closer and closer. And then I kind of turned and stopped and clapped my hands and startled her enough where she dropped the camera. And luckily I was able to retrieve it, and She had a very soft mouth. There was nothing damaged on the camera at all. She was just wanting to play. This next video is another representation of this invitation to play. The setup is I'm exhausted. I was taking a nap, and this wolf, I heard her footfalls coming to check me out, and she's trying to steal something from me, and you'll see what happens here.
Hey girl, just taking a nap. I heard your footfalls. How was your meal? Looks fresh. Oh, you want to nip my pad? I don't think so. Go on now. Leave it. No. Leave it. No. Don't do it.
So based on your laughs, we understand very much what this animal, we can imagine what she's thinking. She's very defeated there at the end, right? Kind of some of her looks throughout. And I share this video not as a kind of look how close I got to wolves one time video. It's an illustration of this very deep relationship that we have with wolves. That is, this animal's not trained by me. I've never fed her. I've never pet her. I have no illusions of us. We're not friends. I'm a curiosity to her and her family. And in this way, I'm also a fellow animal that she understands plays. She's inviting me into her world to play. I want to come rip that little corner of your foam pad off, and I want you to come chase me. That's the game that is at hand. And we as social mammals, especially with dogs, while she doesn't know what I'm saying, she very much understands body language and tone. I raised my hand a couple times as just like an advance, movement that startled her. She took a couple steps back then. When I looked at her, that was another event where she kind of took a couple steps back. There's all these kind of layers of communication that are happening with a fully wild animal that doesn't understand anything I'm saying. And so with the wolves in the Arctic, as you can see, there aren't really the boundaries that existed in Yellowstone. In fact, I had to maintain boundaries around them not stealing things from me. There was never a time people asked very quickly, they're like, well, if these wolves weren't scared of you, then did they ever try to hunt you? Were you ever on the menu? Did you ever feel scared? And this is an illustration of, I'm very relaxed. I'm lying on the ground. I'm in what would be a vulnerable position, but I had spent enough time with them, and it was very clear early on that there's no threat to my safety. I never was lunged at, never nipped, never growled at, all these things that I've had interactions with dogs many times that have acted that way, but with these wild wolves, it was never there. There's no illusions, again, that they definitely have capacity, and people have been killed by wolves and probably will be killed by wolves again, but there's very rare occurrence of that happening in the history of our relationship to them. The main thing that they want to hunt are these very large hooved animals. And this is a muskox. This is a male muskoxen. And they can weigh upwards of 700 pounds. And they're a goat-related species. Once they get kind of wet, you see kind of the goat shape, but they have a very interesting movement and posture to them. And the wolves on Ellesmere, this is the animal that they hunt. There are caribou there, a subspecies of caribou, but they've been tanking because of climate change reasons. And so there was a few dozen of them in the last aerial survey of those caribou. So the main animal they hunt is muskoxen. And here's one of these events where wolves will test animals often just to get them to move. This is a wolf that I called One Eye. She has the left eye, the one that's facing us in this image, is actually turned back in her head, and she's not able to use that to see, but she has one functional eye, and she was a very amazing huntress. And what she's doing here is testing this male muskoxen that had been lying down, and she came by and got him up and basically just wanted to see how he moved, to see how healthy he was. And he was very healthy. And this only lasted for maybe 20 seconds, and then she moved on. The muskoxen have a really amazing ability to defend themselves. This is a very kind of goat behavior, to stand your ground. And of you that have interacted with goats maybe know what I mean. They're a little ornery, and they know that they can work together in this way. And this is a big male muskoxen next to me here, and there's a mix of males and females in this line. But this is not something that deer do. Elk don't really do this. Buffalo do this a little bit, but not to the same extent that muskoxen do. There's nowhere for the muskoxen to run in this open landscape, and so they bunch together for safety and protection. This next series of images is from a day out with the wolves, with the polygon pack. And we had been on the coastline there in the distance on the horizon, and we had moved up kind of into the hills here. We have some of the adult wolves in the front here, and at this particular time, the pups are in the back. You can see some of these smaller bodied animals. There were 4 of these pups at the time, and they're moving up on this landscape, excited to follow the adults and be part of the pack, the family here. And here they are as they're moving. This was over the course of 2 days, we did 65 miles following them. And they were very hungry. They hadn't fed in a few days, and so they're going up high here. I didn't realize why they were going up into the hills, because you don't often find muskoxen there. And then I noticed that they were staring in the distance here. This is one of the wolves called Bright Eyes. And I followed with my binoculars to the hills, kind of up in this direction, and saw a herd of hares, of Arctic hares. There were about 50 or 60 of them, and the wolves spotted them from a long distance away. And the wolves split up, and they did this coordinated attempt to get some of these hares. And I'll let the video kind of speak to how that looked on the landscape. See the herd of hares there now? And there's a couple of wolves moving up here. And the hares are big. They can weigh upwards of 15 pounds. Never did I imagine seeing a herd of hares. This is just a clip from the documentary. And so they weren't successful in that attempt. This is that wolf, One Eye. You can see there her left eye is non-existent. And she's moving up on the landscape. And here's another wolf that I spent a lot of time with called Gray Mane. He was a yearling wolf. And they're continuing to try to go after these hares. But the hares are smart, and the wolves were tired, and they kind of played this cat and mouse game for a while. And you can just see a few of the wolves here, just a couple little specks in the distance. And they got up to this high ridge line, and they came to this kind of couloir, this gully that dropped off, and it was beautiful light, and I'd never seen the wolves this high, and the snow was there. It was the scene where all the wolves are coming down, and they're following the lead wolf at the time, which was, his name was Clean Coat. He was the oldest male. And even the pups are going down. And they went over, and I tried to follow them. I tried to walk and see what was going on, and looking over the edge. And I'm using a machine called a four-wheeler, an ATV. It's how I've followed the wolves. And it's all ice underneath the snow, and I slipped and kind of like slid in the rocks, and it was not a good scene. I was way out of my element, and I started to worry about the wolves and wondering what happened to them. Are they able to stay on their feet? And it took me an hour to get around and find a way to get down. So this previous picture was up here, and the wolves had come down. There's some faint tracks here, and then you can kind of see some clearer tracks here. And they came all the way down this gully, and I'm looking with binoculars kind of down here. I'm looking in the rocks. I was seriously thinking, like, did they slide down? Like, I can't imagine the pups would have made it. And didn't see anybody, didn't see any reference to that. I followed the gully down and out of frame here, got down to the bottom, and maybe 20 minutes later, I was following tracks and came to them, and they were exhausted and they were sleeping, and they were completely fine. And this kind of illusion of them being out of their element was only my own, just wasn't a reality of theirs. But it was a long day with the wolves, the longest day that I had been with them, as I mentioned, 65 miles over the course of a couple days. This final story I'll speak to was one of the trips I was there, a recent one where I was there by myself. And normally I've been there with a team, anywhere between 2 other people or 5 other people. And this particular time, I had accompanied a group of biologists that were doing climate change studies there related to musk oxen. And I stayed on for a few weeks afterwards and set up this little base camp and had my little kitchen set up here, a little solar charger for some communication. And I'd set up some of these rocks around the tent just as kind of like an early alarm to whether or not the wolves were coming by, not out of fear of danger, but mostly just, again, not wanting to steal stuff from me, not wanting them to come. I've had them in the past, like snap the guy lines on the tent just because it's fun. They have those very sharp, like carnassial teeth that they use to tear meat with. They can cut through cord very easily. And I woke up to some of those rocks being moved and opened the tent up, fully expecting to see, gray mane's face or bright eyes. And I saw a different form of a canine. There was these 3 Arctic fox kits that had never seen a human before, I'm sure of, and they were denning up on the hillside and watched me for a few days and finally came down to investigate. And they were a treat to have around camp, except they would sometimes leave turds on my kitchen table, which was very rude and it's very cat-like. But they were these beautiful beings to have around, and after a few days of them watching me and understanding me, they would just be kind of curled up in these little balls, and I'd get up out of my tent and move around camp, and they wouldn't move at all. They would just kind of watch me with their ears, as animals do. And so this particular morning, they had woken me up. I say morning, it's like 1 a.m. This is endless summer that exists in the Arctic. This is the first sunset at the end of August. The sun's up for 4 months of the year, and then there's 4 months of kind of the transition, and there's 4 months of darkness. And so this particular, we'll call it the morning still, I get up to the foxes and look down across the valley, and I can see the wolves are there, and I've been spending my days with them. And this particular trip I was on foot, didn't have any machines, and so was walking around and spending as much time with the wolves as I could, and saw a muskox herd in the distance that I thought maybe the wolves were going to go towards at some point. And they'd been sleeping for the last 15 hours like I had been, and figured that they were going to be up and moving. And so I decided to go to the muskox herd first and hope that they caught up. And I'm in the process of getting there and moving, and I'm kind of jogging a little bit, and I got a backpack. I'm not moving very quickly. And I look behind and I see the wolves are starting to come, which is great. At this stage, it's the Polygon pack. There were 15 adults and 5 pups. And so it's a big group coming, and I've been, again, spending time with them over the last few days. They knew I was there, and I assumed that they saw me running, and I keep moving a little bit. And then I look back and I see Gray Mane, which is a familiar wolf that I've known for years, and he's catching up. And I'm crossing this creek. I got to cross the creek, and I look to my right and I see Gray Mane. And I realized that we're running towards the same thing. We're running towards prey. And it was this moment of understanding that connection that humans and wolves must have had 20,000 years ago, where we would have been moving towards the same prey. And if I was a human with a weapon, and I was going to hunt and going to find food, and we would have worked together in that imaginative experience, I realized very quickly that the domestication would have happened in kind of these scenes like this. And something that, having grown up in Vermont and not knowing about wolves and spending time with wolves in Yellowstone, I never would have dreamed that this was still possible in the modern world, that wolves have not been fully changed by humans, or at least modern humans, that they still maintain some of that wild curiosity that we also have for them. And so in this kind of few moments of Gray Mane and I running alongside each other, he eventually veered off and stopped. And this is kind of sometimes what happens with the wolves, where they get tired, or some of them aren't ready to go hunting, and he laid down, and the rest of the wolves had laid down behind them. And I eventually got to the herd of musk oxen before them, and then saw them in the distance. They had taken a different route and were headed off into a different direction. And it's a scene that, to me, as a very modern human who longs to understand what that old relationship was like to wolves, is a scene that very much still beckons to me. I wish that I could still accompany them and be with them for years, really, to understand more of that relationship and understand more about myself as a human hunter in that way. I'm going to pause there, and we have some time for Q&A, but I appreciate all of your attention and thank you very much for your time. If you have a question, raise your hand, do your best to project, and I'll repeat the question too if it's not loud enough, but we'll start here.
Two quick things. About 20 years ago, my husband and I were canoeing in the Boundary Water canoe area. And I couldn't tell from the map, but we heard wolves frequently. Are they documented as still being there? And is that part?
Yeah, the wolves are in the Great Lakes region. Yeah, that's a place where they still existed even, 70 years ago or so. They weren't fully eradicated from the Great Lakes either. So yeah, you're very, very right. They were there. Yeah, it's amazing to hear them.
And the other is that I wish I'd looked it up before I came. There's at least one and maybe two what they call wolf conservation places in Florida where you can pay to go into an area and get the wolves. You're free within the enclosure. So yes, there are wolves in Florida.
Oh yes. Yes. Well, on that logic, then there's millions, because there's millions of dogs here as well. So yes, there are still wolves in different forms in Florida. Yeah, in the back there.
Yeah, I just had two brief questions. I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate a little bit on what kind of gear you might specifically take with you on a trip like this. And then I was just curious if you were familiar with or had ever met Thomas Mangelson or worked with him.
Yeah, so the first question around gear, the Arctic trip it's kind of a crazy expedition style where the goal is to follow and photograph and spend as much time with wolves. And so that's kind of the setup. That's the goal. And then to achieve that, it's like 10,000 pounds of stuff. And it's kind of crazy. Like I dream of being a minimalist in some forms, but if the goal is to follow wolves and to basically spend every waking of their moments with them, then it's required to have a machine, because they can travel 20, 30 miles in a day, and at a pace that is 7 miles per hour or more, which I can't sustain, or with equipment too. So you're bringing cameras. So 10,000 pounds of gear, half of that would be fuel. So if you have an ATV, a machine, you need to fuel that, and then charging batteries, so a generator. So there's basically like a base camp that is set up, and you have a big, dome tent. There's a kitchen table. You have 1,000 pounds of food for a team of 3 or 4 people for 3 months, and then you would do these kind of forays from a base camp. And then the specific camera equipment, I use Canon cameras, and so just whatever that would be at the time. Like I have a Canon R5 is what I use now, the mirrorless camera, and then anywhere between like a 600 millimeter lens to maybe a 100 to 400 millimeter lens. And then with the Arctic wolves, a lot of these images are taken with wide angle lens between like 24 to 50 millimeters because they're close. And that's a lot of what is allowed in the Arctic in terms of proximity. Is I don't need those motion triggered cameras as much because I can be the camera still. Like I can be there with them. And then, yeah, I know Tom well, looked up to him for years of my career, and able to call him a friend now and a mentor. And yeah, he's done a lot for conservation and photography. Yes, they're in the middle.
With all the research you've done on wolves, with the Native Americans, before the Spaniards introduced the horse into Mexico, we've been taught that Native Americans used dogs to use with travois to transport their teepees, their goods, etc. Is there any information you found on whether those were wolves that were domesticated by the Native Americans, and anything more about it? Because I'm fascinated by that. Because before the horse, the Native Americans relied on dogs, but what you're saying is the dogs are the subspecies of the wolf. So were these dogs subspecies and they were able to train them because they weren't afraid of humans at that point?
Yeah, it's a good question. So there's some really interesting information around like the size of teepees changed when the horse was introduced. The teepees could get bigger because they could use horses to tow more and more equipment, basically camp and move camp. And before that, you're right, it was dogs, and those dogs were large. They looked very similar to a wolf. There's a breed of dog that apparently isn't around anymore, but they called it an Indian dog, and it looked kind of similar to wolves, but it had little like more domestic features. So basically, domestic dogs are kind of like a wolf stunted at a year old, and their kind of ears can be floppy, their tails can curl, their coat colors can change. The black coat color in wolves, in wild wolves, is an outcome from domestic wolves that happened before people even came over from Eurasia. So the Beringia land bridge and people coming across over the last 20,000 years, they brought dogs with them, but they basically looked like wolves. And you could imagine, I remember reading an account of I think it was a Sioux Native American band in the Western United States, and there were 3,000 people and then 6,000 dogs moving in this kind of convoy as they're moving camp. And so they had a lot of the dogs with them, and there was a constant flow of genetics is my understanding, and also just kind of the logic of it. If you have that many dogs, they're going to get bred by wolves for sure at different points throughout the year. Female goes into heat and she goes off, and a wolf catches scent of that, they're going to get bred. And that's something that even in the north and the Arctic, the Inuit would do with some of their sled dogs, is they would want to have wolf genetics throughout their sled dog team every once in a while. And so there was a constant flow of domestication. And there's some really wild stories from, like in Barry Lopez's book of Wolves and Men. There's a story of Blackfeet Indians that found a wolf den that had flooded, and there was only one pup that was still alive, and they raised that pup, and they went on this series of adventures down into like Wyoming from Montana, raiding horses with this wolf, and it helped them throughout all these adventures. And then at 2 years old, the wolf went off, and they never saw the wolf again. It became a wild wolf again. So the flow was very, very close in that way. And it's very recent that wolves are fearful of humans in this way. Lewis and Clark wrote about wolves being on the banks of the rivers that they were along, just kind of sitting, watching them. Clark bayoneted a wolf because it was close, because it was coming to be curious, maybe trying to play keep away. But that just speaks to how recent wolves were unafraid of humans. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes.
So you talked a lot about the wolves aren't afraid of us, and like how you kind of coexist and that. And that was a really cool video that you put up with the wolf up by you where he's trying to nibble on your thing. Do you think a lot of that, them not being, well, saying that you're on the menus, they're like, well, that guy doesn't look like a deer, that guy doesn't look like a buffalo, kind of like how a shark doesn't really want to eat us, we don't look like seals. Is it kind of similar to that, you think?
Yeah, I think that in general, like the amount of time that we spend in nature, in wild places, for like how much grace we're given, like it's remarkable. Like it speaks to how little of animals think of us as being on the menu. Like we spend so much time in the wild, and we are so easy to eat. Like really, like we're not super fast. We don't have great hearing. Our smell isn't that awesome. We don't have claws. We don't even have fur. Like fur is like a shield in lots of ways. Like animals fight with each other, and we're like made out of paper mache compared to that. So like a lot of bear attacks. Those are 85% of them are defensive attacks, and the injuries that we sustain is because of that paper mache-ness, because of how flimsy we are. It's not necessarily they're trying to do as much harm as happens to us, but it's because of how flimsy we are. And so I think we have that going for us in some ways that animals give us that grace. And then this upright thing, like it looks like I'm displaying kind of all the time, like being tall and being, when a bear wants to display, or wolves, they try to get bigger. Bears literally stand up on their hind legs. And I think that this form is just, it's weird to animals, and that works in our favor in terms of, not being on the menu. Yes.
You spoke early on of the reintroduction from British Columbia of wolves into Yellowstone.
Mm-hmm.
Knowing the tight-knit family groups, were they captured in their groups and re-released, or as single wolves? That would make a huge difference in their success in Yellowstone with
Yeah, the question is around the wolves that were captured to be reintroduced into Yellowstone from Canada. Were they captured as family groups, or were they captured as individuals? So my understanding is that when you do a reintroduction, the goal is to jumpstart the genetic diversity very quickly. And so they specifically chose individual wolves that weren't related from different packs. And so they broke up family groups, they brought them to Yellowstone, they kept them in holding pens for sometimes it was a few months before they released them, as a way of trying to build the relationship before they released them. And then they released, and then a lot of those wolves stayed together and hunted together. And this same reintroduction happened in Colorado just in the last couple of years, and it was done in a similar way. Yeah. So it is a challenge thinking about kind of the lengths that modern humans have to go to try to make up for what previous modern humans did. Like, wiping out all the wolves in the lower 48 just about requires some of this, seemingly this way of reintroducing them to have them back on the landscape, which is very complex. And it's not a clear idea of how it's supposed to be done. It's a new thing that humans are engaged in.
Yes.
Yes, is any progress being made in Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming in particular about this wolf hate thing that's basically based on ignorance and myth? So are you seeing any progress? And I heard your great interview yesterday on Talking Animals on a community radio station, WNNA. And you said they even have a wolf hate tag. I think was it Montana or one of the states, one of the states. But is there any evolution to this?
Yeah, for those in the back, the question is just around, like, there's a lot of people in the Western United States that really don't like wolves and actively hate them, and have the license plate that says wolf hater, and they hunt wolves, and they will sit on the boundary of Yellowstone National Park waiting for wolves that live in the park to be legally hunted and also illegally hunted. There's still a lot of poaching that goes on in all the states around Yellowstone. And Wyoming in particular, they have 80% of their state is a zone where you can kill wolves any time of the year without a tag. There's no regulation on it. And then only 20% of the state has a regulated wolf hunt. They keep their wolves at around 250 wolves total, which is the kind of minimum before, I think 220 or 200 wolves is the minimum before they would have to be listed or potentially listed by the federal government and controlled in that way. And so the question was about, is there any progress? And I see the wolf conflict, or conflict with nature in general, is a product of like unwell people in this way. We have been disconnected from nature. Any idea of us being in conflict with nature is a conflict with ourselves. There's a quote in the exhibit from Barry Lopez that speaks to, we project onto the wolves the characteristics we most hate and fear of ourselves. And I think that anytime you hate nature, there's an opportunity to look within. Why would we hate nature if we are part of nature? And so the idea of hating wolves and killing wolves for sport and for fun, or they call it fun, it is something that I think that there's just a lot of pain, and most of these are men that are doing this activity. There's a lot of identity and pain and trauma of trying to uphold this idea of like the rugged Western ideal. This kind of cowboy myth is still a very alive archetype in the Western United States, and wolves, unfortunately, kind of bear the brunt of some of that. Yeah, in the middle.
Could you comment on the dynamic between coyotes and wolves in the wild? Coyotes are everywhere. I go for a walk in the morning, I can see 3 coyotes right here in St. Petersburg. And they seem to be ubiquitous throughout the United States.
Yeah, coyotes and wolves. So the relationship between coyotes and wolves, they cohabitate in certain parts of the United States. There's a line that was somewhere around kind of the Midwest, let's say like the Mississippi River drainage, where coyotes didn't go east of there until about 200 years ago, when um, colonization and destroying the wolves and eradicating wolves started to remove wolves from the eastern United States. And coyotes started to backfill this kind of absence of wolves, and they would breed with wolves as they were moving to the east. And so the coyote of the east is kind of a coy wolf, is a term that people use for them. They have upwards of maybe 20 or 30% genetics of wolves. So I guess another reason there are some wolfish critters still in Florida, and they've come into this open kind of habitat in the sense that they fit in really well around humans. They're very adaptable in lots of ways, and all over the east they have essentially populated north to south, up Maine all the way down into Florida here, as you're referencing, and they weren't here before. The red wolf is a wolf that looks kind of similar to coyotes. They also can crossbreed with coyotes, which is one of the challenges of their reintroduction. But they were not coyotes, and coyotes were a Western species before modern humans came and started meddling with things. So yeah, that's the relationship. But in Yellowstone, once wolves came back, they lowered the population of coyotes. Wolves kill coyotes when they can. Mm-hmm. Yeah, way in the back corner.
I'm not sure if you already explained it, but how did you become a national photographer, geograph, or when did it start, or how did you get interested in it?
Questions about how did I get started with National Geographic and what was the kind of the interest there. And I was a field biologist before for about 8 years out of college and did a bunch of different jobs around the world. I did a spotted owl project in California. I did marine mammal watching all around the world, mostly around the coast of Africa. I studied chimpanzees for a year in Uganda. And that research project with chimps, I was using photography as a research tool. And that project was my introduction to National Geographic. I did that project in 2011, and then I submitted some of the images to an editor in 2012, and then my first job with them was 2014. And the why of it, why I transferred, was I was constantly bumping up against these conservation issues with the species that I was doing research with, especially the chimps. And I was developing photography along the way and felt like I wanted to tell stories and share about these challenges that we're facing in the natural world as a way of trying to generate positive change towards a planet in balance, as humans being part of that. And I have been walking that path with photography and storytelling and video as well, and speaking and exhibits in these different forms as a way of trying to make change.
And do you have a highlight?
A highlight?
Working with them, or yeah?
A highlight with working with National Geographic?
Yeah, a day or favorite memory, or I don't know.
Yeah, I think, this last story I shared about this longing to be more wild in my own way and to be with wolves, that is something that is still kind of unfolding. And National Geographic has been kind of at the heart of that, allowing me to pursue these stories and to understand myself in ways that I still can be more wild. That's going to be the rest of my life, is trying to understand what that looks like. I've made my own hide shoes. I've started hunting. I've started to try to understand what it's like to be more of a human animal and to be in animate relationship to the natural world. And National Geographic has enabled that in my life, which I'll be forever grateful for. We have time for one more question.
What animal would you like to research or photograph next?
What animal would I like to photograph or research next? I grew up in Vermont, and I'm obsessed with salamanders. probably didn't see that coming, but yeah, I was just there with my family like a week ago and my nephew and spotted salamanders and all these magical creatures, and I'd like to spend more time in the forests where I grew up. So perhaps that'll come next. But yeah, again, thank you all so much for your time. Appreciate it.